I don't particularly have a cold open for this video, so I'll just acknowledge instead that yes, apparently it was time again for my hair to get slightly shorter. I don't know if it's that, or maybe I've got the camera set up differently, but to me at least, my head looks smaller than usual. I don't know. If I've just pointed it out to you and you now notice it, sorry. But either way, hello and welcome to the Ragnarok Chronicles. My name is Dominic and this is the channel where we talk about the lore of the books that I am writing, or just talk about writing in general. Now, as ever, when we do these sorts of videos, talking about the creative process as a more nebulous thing, I am by no means an expert. I am not saying that these are the only ways to do things or that mine is in any way right. This is simply acknowledging that this is how I rationalise things and how I go about it, perceive it, to give you an insight into that sort of workings of my mind as a writer, if that's of any interest to you. As you may see from the title of this video and its thumbnail, the topic we'll be discussing today is that of open and closed-natured endings to stories, each of which in turn are going to have their pros and cons depending on which situation, and even against those, you can make them work regardless. If you, say, are doing a one-off story, then presumably, unless you're trying to go for a specific effect at the end, you're going to want to go for a closed ending to give the consumer, whether that's a reader or a viewer, listener, whatever it is, closure. It would be frustrating to suddenly have the major plot threads or whatever it is just abruptly stop or not get resolved, and you're instead left wondering, well then what happened next? If you want to know what that feeling is like, then turn to any of a number of TV shows that have been cancelled on cliffhangers, or if not on a specific cliffhanger, then nevertheless earlier than they really should have. You're giving them a contained narrative, and at the end of it, they should be able to think, yes, that was a complete package that they have consumed. You can nevertheless have elements left over. Not everything is completely ironed out or explained or explored. I'm more just referring to that central narrative plot through point. Wording. Indeed, having those other separate details elsewhere remaining obscure can be of interest to people like myself who would consider themselves theorists, where things are involved, to take the term from MatPats, game theorists and adjacent channels. By contrast, if you were doing something where you knew that you were getting sequels, or at least you were planning to do sequels, that would be where an open ending might be more likely. Where this could be in the case of if it is a continuous narrative across all the installments, the main narrative drive isn't complete yet, you reach some sort of climax in this chapter, but things still are left to be done elsewise afterwards. Or indeed, if you're doing a sequence of stories, yet they are more episodic in nature, they're or same characters or whatever it is that is the common element, but nevertheless contained separate adventures, those still probably are going to be close-ended. So it depends, but you probably are going to get away with having open-ended things if you are intending to do more stories otherwise. It can be that you start off doing something that is a one-off installment and it is a closed-off narrative, but then later down the line, either because of your own creative interest or by public demand, you suddenly decide, okay, we're going to do a new story based on it afterwards. Well, that's fine, can be done, and there will be examples where it's done well, but in those cases my reticence would be that because it hasn't been planned to do more stories, there isn't necessarily the intentional groundwork having already been laid. You can, as I said, to give an example as to what I just alluded to, with Johnny English and then Johnny English Reborn, the second film, Reborn, I can only assume was not intended to be made when the first one was. However, you then get away with the second film largely being different and not picking up on anything previously. It's doing its own thing, because there is a noticeable and acknowledged time gap in between, and during that interim, things have been reinvented and rebuilt from the ground up. If more you were doing stories that were fairly consecutive chronologically, and you just suddenly think, oh, and now we're going to suddenly be exploring this. You may have people like myself, where you now start asking questions, well, where was the evidence of that existing in the world previously. Again, only matters if you are someone like me who will start pointing out that sort of thing. If you're not, you just have to go with the flow. Great. Good. Yeah. My point is that, for me at least as an example, I would always want to make sure there were, even if the story is going to be separate, that if I knew sort of what was going to be coming later, I would set up some sort of, background details at minimum that establish that that is already coexisting, or that that is something that's going to happen later, if that makes sense within the story. This doesn't always work itself. When writing Gift of the Mansin, the first book, like the very first draft, just going through it, I included a very brief detail with the intention that in book 2, The Ark of Angels, it would be brought back in a much more meaningful way. So, I see what I was setting up. Through a combination then of forgetting that I'd done this and changing the direction in which I wanted to take book 2 and its development, by the time I ended up writing that had zero compatibility with what I'd written previously. And indeed, when I went back to book 1 and I read that, I realised, this now is erroneous and actually doesn't gel. I removed it entirely. So if you are setting things up, then you are rather locking yourself into using them, unless, assuming that the first instalment has already been released. If, like me, I was writing it all more in one go before any of the releases, I was able to make those corrections. But if you say were to make a film and you set up things for a sequel and the film's released and then you go on to make the second one and you've changed your mind, whatever, it could be that you nevertheless find a way to reinterpret what you set up before and you can use it in a new way. Maybe rather you are forced to commit to it if you're worrying about that sort of continuity. Otherwise, instead, you just end up ignoring it or overlooking it or contradicting it. And again, you come back to people like me who may pick up on that and say, what? I will say that as a creator, it is probably classifiable as a flaw of mine that I do try to set up those sort of things. Not talking about, in this example, the books themselves, Chronicles, but other things that I would like to do if possible as well, which will also take many years if I got around to doing it. But I would end up early on setting up those details that wouldn't be paid off until the end. That means, though, you're probably going a couple of decades before the payoff, in which case audiences either aren't going to remember, aren't going to care, or are going to have got annoyed with you in the interim saying, well, why haven't you addressed this yet? Strictly speaking, for some of those that I'm thinking of, they probably wouldn't be things that you'd think to question until you looked back on them afterwards, but either way. My drive towards doing that in that case is, to give contrast, in shows like Fringe or other things that J.J. Abrams have been involved in before, so using him specifically as an example, his style of doing things, which is perfectly right, it's his style, he'll do things as he wants, but from what I understand and what the track record seems to be is that he will do a lot of setup in the beginning without plans for what's going to be the resolution of that or what's going to come later. So what ends up happening is as the show or films or whatever it is goes along, they start going in unexpected directions, and trying to view the thing as a whole can get complicated. Well, you're now trying to accommodate for things that you set up previously while also come up with other new things as you go along, and it can be a little bit of a mess. Fringe is one of the things where if you watch it casually, just not paying attention to the overarching story, it's fine, good. Start paying attention to the overarching story, it doesn't make sense. Spend a lot of time thinking about it, make a lot of inferences about other timelines and stuff, because there are timelines in the show, I'm not just adding that randomly. It can make sense again, but you have to infer a lot of things that probably weren't being thought of. Either way. Because, while I do like the show overall, that is not a manner of storytelling that I appreciate. I like there to be some forethought put into it and for planning, even if new ideas are come up with later. I feel the want to demonstrate that my long-term projects are thought out from the beginning, even if elements do change later on, whatever, that I did have some kind of roadmap in mind. Therefore, it's difficult for me to stop myself from, if not the first story, an early story, adding in little bits that are purely there to set up to, or by the time we get to the end, be able to be looked back upon and say, oh, I see what that was doing. Still, though, being able to enjoy the earlier stories in themselves beforehand, so like, there's lingering, what does this mean throughout all of it, but it's an added embellishment. Before we get on to the books, my books themselves, which is really what this is, well, it's been tending towards at this point, I will just say as a final note on, this is a more general notion, again, everyone's opinions are going to be different. And in general, you're not going to please everyone in a creative field or otherwise. But I have heard it said by someone I know previously that they don't appreciate it when a story is clearly setting up for something else other, or, not even necessarily a cliffhanger, but there is going to be a continuation because they feel that that is them just, as in the creators, trying to lead you on to spending more money. This is mostly in the context of films and cinema, more than, say, TV shows, but I suppose it can also relate to books. Rather than say, well, why give a single story and that's that. Don't force me to have to spend more money than I necessarily would want to. So that's potentially, again, another reason to go against open-ended things. But to counter that, I'll then address you to most of what I've just been saying so far. Not all stories can be told in a single contained narrative. You may want to do more, and if you are going to do that, I would personally prefer to set that up beforehand. With the books, I have always said that when thinking about the Ragnarok Chronicles as a wider book franchise, while yes, it is going to have a large number, in theory, of installments overall, these are broken down into smaller sub-series that will be read, self-contained. You can just read the 2016 series that is all out now, links in the description below, without reading any of the rest. You should be able to pick up a later sub-series set in a different year without having read anything that's come before the end. The exception may end up being the final duology, not biology, but, two-part story at the very end of the whole thing, because that will be building upon a number of things set up previously. Older me will hopefully try to make it accessible regardless, but that one aside, each of the individual sub-series, whether it's a one-off book or the longest is meant to be 7 books, you can read each of those separately and that would all be fine. From that point of view, their main narrative plot threads are closed-ended by the time you get to the end. You may end up having characters then turning up in future ones, or other elements being picked up on again, but the arc that those characters are going through in those stories is complete. It's when just thinking about that idea of either people or things carrying on into future sub-series that we're now thinking of those more smaller details or side details that more world building or fleshing things out, which may be picked up upon, may indeed be separate entirely to the main story that's going on, but included for the sake of, as I just said, fleshing out this world further, picking us out so that they can carry on and tie this more together as a franchise. That's where some of your secondary, open-ended side things. Okay, we're done with the main thing. We could pick up on those later if we wanted. Within a sub-series, though, with your individual books, the only thing we'll really talk about at the moment, because they're the ones I've written, would be, say, the set of 4, Gift of the Manson through Tower of the Storm. Each of those cases, while technically it is a continuous narrative of what is happening to Philip and his peers over this summer, each book is a different adventure. Gift of the Manson technically is multiple mini starting adventures, but they are distinct. It's not a case of, let's say, one continuous narrative that I could have broken in different places, could have taken the overall timeline and split it into 3 rather than 4, just made them slightly longer to put in the breaks separately. Now these are separate things. Book 2, Arc of Angels, is specifically about the arc, in a different way, arc for finding the arc. Book 3 is specifically its own thing. Book 4 is specifically its own thing, even though they are rather following one onto the next, onto the next. As such, as I say, book 1 is more of just an introductory thing, so it doesn't necessarily have an entire arc to round off in the same way. There are elements that are set up in the prologue, which are paid off at the end, but either way, the point is, each book has its own thing, and those are ended at the end of those books. The story, as I said, may carry on straight afterwards, but the conceit has been completed. We have crossed that finish line and are now just on the next lap. There are overt cliffhangers at the end, but those are with the purpose of setting up what comes next, not still as a part of, I'm justifying in this case, not still as a part of what has just been happening prior. We should be able to say, okay, that chapter is done, move on to the next. By that same token though, as I say, because they are ending on cliffhangers within the series, that is to something like, it should be a closed-ended thing within an open-ended tag on the end. So there is nevertheless that prompt to carry on to the next one. If you're doing a series like this is here, I suppose that's something that you can more do in the later installments, because if a consumer, reader, viewer, listener, whoever, has got to that point in the series, they're probably going to be committing to continuing with the rest. With your first installment, that probably is the one where you're going to want to be allowing it to be more of just its own contained thing, with just the potential to carry on. So if someone picks up the first book and read it and they say, okay, we're not going to continue with it, but I nevertheless feel like I've had a full experience. I'm not left with a, oh, what happened next? As I say, I'm saying this with Gifted to Manson ending on a cliffhanger, but, you know, we should have said what we saw there has been seen through. Unless I'm doing something which is specifically self-contained, single thing, which is very rarely, I am personally not going to be inclined towards doing a completely closed-off ending. I'm going to want an open ending because I'm going to want to say, well, how is this going to flow through? I want to indicate to the whoever it is, this is where we're still going on to next. To, yes, indicate that I do have a plan for this, I'm not making it up as I go, and also to keep them engaged and make them wanting to come back for more. I do recognise, though, that you shouldn't go too overboard with this, otherwise eventually you're just taking the mick. We'll see. As I established at the beginning, this is merely how I think about it, how I am inclined to plot out and structure my endings, without giving any actual details at any point about what those endings are, but insight, if preferred. In no way saying this is the best way to do it, nor am I saying I'm an expert, just this channel is all about what I'm creating, imagining, so this is me too. If you are someone who comes up with stories of your own, then you can let me know how your innate methodology compares. If you have an innate methodology, you're not just seeing how it goes each time, well, let me know that as well. There are comments for if you whatever want to say in a more coherent way than that just sentence was. If you found it interesting, there are plenty of other videos on this channel, as there will be in the future. Well, we'll have to see. I don't know if things are potentially going to be changing just with my own availability to make these videos, but I'll be trying to continue on the schedule. But regardless, whatever it is that you choose to do, just remember to keep on telling stories. And hopefully that was a closed ending.